my focus has always been on the broader social questions on the population at large, as opposed to the intellectuals.
And so that's in a way a sort of important development, you could say, of a longstanding, not exactly tension, but just that there's different historical methods. And an archaeologist like yourself, it's the dependence in biblical studies, you could say, is it maybe a tendency to move perhaps somewhat quickly between the literary representation that you have in the textual world to some surmise about the actual historical context. But as an independent matter, of course, they would all agree, well, we can't just go from the literary representation to the historical context, but you can see how naturally that has been a tendency. Whereas in your approach using archaeology, you're saying, right, well, we have these literary representations. They're, of course, invaluable as historical evidence, but at the same time, they don't tell us anything, as you said, about the vast majority of people or what we can know for sure, given the actual, you could say, hard data we have in archaeology. This is a question that I think is very related to your book that I'd love to get your thoughts on, which is, I'm going to set it up by telling you where I want to go. The question is going to be, do you think, as we understand halakha, or what you call Torah Judaism in the book, that you're tracing the origins of, do you think that could ever be practically existent the way it is without a highly developed literate society? Because I think a lot of what I wonder about, like when I read Ezra and even the incursion of, for example, the evidence that that there's a hostility to Samaritans in the book of Ezra, but we know that hostility historically didn't emerge until comparable to the time period you're actually arguing you show that the earliest evidence we have of Torah observance, roughly 3rd to 2nd century, based on my reading of this scholarship. But my understanding is there's, for example, not any compelling evidence that there was a hostility between Judeans and Samaritans in the, say, 5th century, in the early period of the sort of Persian exile. But that is reflected actually in the book of Ezra. That's, I think it's in Ezra 4, if I remember right. Ezra has some passages of Aramaic, like Daniel. And so I wonder often, as a historian of philosophy, Plato has an extremely influential discussion of writing and the end of the dialogue, the Phaedo, or the Phaedrus, which is, I think, the most sophisticated kind of ancient theory about the influence of writing. And Socrates claims it comes from Naucratis, Egypt, and it's a legend about the gods. But the argument is, we know in the 4th century in Plato's writings in Greek, there's a very sophisticated conversation that emerges about what are the social intellectual consequences of introducing literacy into society. So in terms of a terminus a quo for that conversation, it's at least Plato in the 4th century. Now, very interestingly, that's a full 150 to 250 years prior to the evidence for the archaeological evidence for the observance of Torah. So I'm wondering, in a broad sense, do you have any thoughts about how literacy itself and the development of, for example, the incredibly profound culture of rabbinic literacy may be related to why and when Torah observance emerges when it does?
So there's a lot there to unpack.
And please feel free to contest if I'm wrong on any of the premises.
Not a problem. So number one, I want to be clear that rabbinic interpretations begin to emerge. Well, okay, the rabbinic literature that we have, this is a whole Pandora's box in and of itself. I don't use the term, I don't speak about rabbinic halakha in my book because I'm going from the 1st century of the Common Era backwards. So the earliest rabbinic literature that we have is usually thought to have been composed around the year 200 CE. Of course, it contains earlier traditions, but I put rabbinic halakha to the side for the purpose of the book. And my focus is on the first century authors and 1st century archaeological evidence and earlier. So rabbinic halakha doesn't come in so much, but of course that's the continuation of the historical trajectory of Torah observance. It turns into rabbinic halakha, and it's a direct continuation. So just to put that on the side. As far as your question is concerned, it's a very important question. So what we have with Judaism is a something along the lines of avoiding the need for literacy by a new invention, a new institution called the synagogue. What is the synagogue? So the synagogue, it appears to have first emerged around this time, around the Hasmonean period, maybe the late 2nd century, 1st century BCE. When we hear the term synagogue today, the first thing that we think of is prayer. But actually, all of our early evidence for the early synagogue at this time, prayer doesn't appear at all. There was no prayer in the synagogue. The synagogue was an educational institution. The synagogue was the place where ordinary people, would gather together once a week on Saturdays, on Shabbat, when they weren't going to work, and they would listen to the Torah being read. The Torah was read and it was interpreted. Now, we have to remember that at this time, most people probably were not literate. Certainly, most people didn't have literature in their home, right? For us today, having a book in the house is nothing. But in ancient times, it would mean having a scroll, right? Nobody had scrolls in their homes. This was something which was very expensive. And again, most people wouldn't have known how to read it anyway. But on the other hand, in order for Judaism to spread, in order for people to know what's written in this Pentateuch, they would need to be able to read it. But okay, if we have a synagogue, we don't actually need to know how to read, and we don't need to have a book. All we need is for one person in the community to know how to read, and one person in the community, or for the community itself, to own a scroll. And then we can gather together once a week, and the scroll would be taken out. The person who knew how to read it would read it, and the person who knew how to interpret it would go about interpreting it. So in this way, I think we bypass the need for actual literacy through the institution of the synagogue. So the synagogue is this institution for mass education without the need for literacy. It's a unique institution. We don't have other institutions like that elsewhere at this time. We have the gymnasium for children, but this is for the entire community. It's for adults. It's for we might call it ongoing education today. But I see the synagogue as the engine for spreading Judaism in its early days. This is the way that the ordinary people that we're talking about got to know what was written in the Torah. It's also interesting when we look at the architecture of these early synagogues. They're built with benches surrounding a central open area, right? So these are buildings with benches surrounding each side of each of the walls, each of the four walls, which meant that the focus of everyone assembled in this room was towards the middle. Presumably, whoever was reading from the Torah would stand in the middle and read for everyone. So it allowed everyone to focus on what was going on in the middle, on the teacher, the reader, and the person that's expounding on what's written. But it also allowed people to interact with each other. So if we think about the way a parliament is set up, where people can talk to each other. So, and this is the sense that we get from the written sources that describe what was going on in the synagogues. What I'm imagining is that this was a place where people could actually interact with each other, because the Pentateuch is an opaque text. It's difficult to know what it says. It's open to interpretation, and I think that the synagogue is the place where this interpretation was going on. This is where people were interacting. They were arguing, debating, and essentially it's from this time that we begin to see the debates that develop into the rabbinic, the world of the rabbis, where they're debating with one another. It all begins here. The earliest debates, recorded debates that we have in rabbinic literature come from the Hasmonean period. I'm imagining that it was in the synagogue. This is the setting for the sprouting of these debates.
And this is beautiful because you talk, and I'm glad you brought up the synagogue because you it's part of the evidence that you bring out. Again, people have assumed often maybe a slightly earlier historical origin of the synagogue, but you have a whole chapter on the evidence around the synagogue. Could you maybe even talk about what you discovered about, again, when do we know what's the earliest evidence for the synagogue as we're thinking about it that it emerged is around this time period? Is that correct? This Hasmonean period.
Sure. Yeah. So it's been argued before that the synagogue might. There are different ideas about when the synagogue first developed, when it first emerged. We have inscriptional evidence from Egypt from the late third century BCE of an institution called the proseuche in Greek. Proseuche means a prayer. As an institution, a proseuche is a place of prayer. And that's often conflated with the synagogue, which is a place of assembly, right? So what we find, most of our written evidence, most of our textual evidence about what was going on, what I just described, that the synagogue was a place of Torah reading, that evidence mostly comes from the first century of the Common Era. We don't really have texts that describe the synagogue any time before that. The reason why I think that the synagogue did emerge slightly before the first century CE, before our earliest written evidence, is because we have at least one building, one archaeologically unearthed synagogue, a building that's been identified as a synagogue, which is said to be dated to the Hasmonean period. There's no final report, so it's hard to pinpoint any further than that. But my sense is that well, according to the early reports, this synagogue, it's in Umm that's the name of the site, has been dated to the Hasmonean period. So we need to distinguish between the institution of a synagogue, where there's this gathering for the purpose of reading of the Torah and its interpretation, and the proseuche, which is something else. That's something to do, apparently, with prayer. This was an institution which we find in Egypt, and there's no evidence to suggest that Torah was being read. There's no evidence that this was a educational institution of any sort. Again, because we're used to the idea that a synagogue is where you go for prayer, we sometimes have this anachronistic mistake that we think that, okay, synagogue is a place for prayer. Synagogue in the first century must have been a place for prayer. Proseuche is a place for prayer. Proseuche in a synagogue is the same thing. We need to be very careful, and when we have evidence for something, to focus on what the evidence is actually telling us. So when we have a proseuche in the 3rd century BCE, it's a place of prayer. It might have been something along the lines of a temple of some sort, perhaps. We don't know exactly what was going on. Beyond prayer, were there sacrifices being offered? Was there incense being burned? We essentially don't know from the inscriptions that we have. We don't have any buildings, by the way, that we can identify as proseuche from the 3rd century. None of these inscriptions come together with buildings, so we don't really know what was going on in them. But what we don't have is any evidence that they were being used as educational institutions, like the synagogue was afterwards. So, yeah, there is no evidence for synagogues as educational institutions where the Torah was being read and interpreted anytime prior to the Hasmonean period.
Okay. And so in terms of just, because I know my question was complex and I really appreciate it because it's something I've wondered about since I read the book and seeing a lot of the conversations you've had with Dr. Gad Barnea as well, who will be part of this symposium. I've often wondered about, right, what is the process by which what you're calling Torah observance would socially have been formed? And your argument is the synagogue is the key institution that mediates a kind of heightened literacy or the origins of literacy to make the Torah applicable. Like however long the Torah existed, you would need something like the synagogue as you've defined it, a place of study, essentially. For me as a historian of philosophy, it's striking because this is post-sectarian philosophy. It's about in the exact time period that we see within 100 to 150 years. You can correct me that the sects of Judaism, as we might say, somewhat anachronistically, that are identified by Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, many people will think something like the Essenes, a group that are called the Therapeutai. But by this period that we have the evidence you're describing for the synagogue, at least some of the earlier evidence, definitively in the 1st century, but you just mentioned why you think probably earlier, there was a tradition of something like a regular kind of educational gathering, very much like a philosophical school, but centered on textual formation, textual exposition. And towards the end of the book, as you develop this evidence, you don't give any definitive theory about why this may have emerged in the Hasmonean period. But could you talk more about that period and what you think, what you suggest in the book, and then maybe what your research has led you to think may have been going on that could explain why we get suddenly now we have this archaeological evidence emerging?
Okay, so I'm going to divide my answer into two. You mentioned the rise of the sects, or the emergence of the sects, and then why the Torah might have emerged in the Hasmonean period. In terms of in terms of the sects, indeed, scholars generally think that the sects emerged in the Hasmonean period, and which is in and of itself very interesting. What essentially is the emergence of the sects? Many scholars have noticed that when we see descriptions of these sects in the works that you described, and also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I should add, although they are not named there as we find them in our writers like Philo, Josephus, and so on, New Testament texts as well. But we can kind of make out the named sects in the descriptions that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In any event, scholars tend to see the emergence of these sects in the Hasmonean period. That's not surprising, right? Once the Torah becomes widely known and regarded as authoritative, and because the Torah is opaque and open to interpretation, a wide spectrum of interpretations, it's not surprising that soon after the Torah becomes widely known and authoritative, the sects emerge, and we have arguments about how we should interpret the Torah. It would be surprising if the Torah was well known and regarded as authoritative for centuries before, let's say from the 5th century before the Common Era. Nobody was arguing about it. Everyone agreed what needs to be done. There were no sects that were dividing up. Everyone was just in agreement. Everyone understood what was written, and nobody had any arguments. And then, in a few centuries later, in the 2nd century BCE, suddenly mayhem broke loose. That's hard to imagine. It makes sense that the reason why the sects are splitting up and why people start arguing about how to understand the Torah is because this is when the Torah first becomes well known and regarded as authoritative. So that's in terms of the sects. In terms of how, when, and why the Torah did become authoritative. So again, the earliest evidence we have is from the Hasmonean period. We don't have anything before that. And then we can put on the table as this is. Nobody has argued with me about this. There is no, to date, this is the earliest evidence that we have. In the final chapter of the book, I get into a speculative discussion about, okay, when did the Torah become authoritative? And to my mind, I'm becoming more and more convinced that a good model for how the Torah might have become regarded as authoritative is to look at the Hasmoneans themselves as those responsible, as the authority, the power that might have been responsible for adopting the Torah as the legal basis of their new polity. So just to give a little bit of background, We know that there was until let's say the 160s BCE, the Seleucid Hellenistic kingdom, which ruled out of Antioch in Syria, ruled over the southern Levant, ruled over Judea. And there was a revolt. The Judeans revolted, and under the Hasmonean family, obtained, to make a long story short, obtained independence from the Seleucid kingdom and established their own independent Judean state, right? The first independent Judean state since, let's say, 586 BCE. Sometime in the middle of the second century BCE, we have, it was a process. It took a few decades to become more and more independent. Eventually, we have a fully independent Judean state, and this was ruled by successive rulers from the Hasmonean family. First, we have the brothers, Judah Maccabee and his brothers. The last of his brothers to rule was Simon, and then his son John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus is the first to mint coins. So we have archaeological numismatic evidence for John Hyrcanus, and the model that I'm suggesting is that it was the Hasmoneans that were the ones that adopted the Torah as the law of the land, and essentially enforced this Torah on the people. To what extent the people were happy to accept it, I don't know. We can discuss this. We can think about this. Exactly what the mechanism was, we can also talk about. We can imagine. We don't have any evidence for this. This is all speculative. But this is the model that I suggest. What I think supports this model is that we have textual sources which tell us, and this is supported, by the way, by the archaeological evidence, that John Hyrcanus, around 110 BCE, conquered the neighbors, the southern neighbors of the Judeans, the Idumeans, and enforced the Torah on the Idumeans. He forced them to circumcise, and he forced them to accept the laws of the Torah. Afterwards, we hear about Aristobulus, the next Hasmonean ruler, who conquered the northern neighbors of the Judeans, the Samaritans, and conquered the Iturians, who are even further to the north in Galilee. And he did the same thing with the Iturians. He enforced the laws of the Torah. He forced them to circumcise and adopt the laws of the Torah as their own. The fact that we have these Hasmonean rulers doing this, enforcing the laws of the Torah on the Judean, the neighbors of the Judeans, to my mind, is suggestive that this is a thing that the Hasmoneans were doing. They were taking the Torah as a tool to bring together the peoples that they were ruling over, the peoples that they had conquered. I don't think it's a crazy suggestion that perhaps they or their predecessors did exactly the same thing with the Judeans themselves. So that's the model that I'm suggesting, that the enforcement of the Torah on the Judeans can be attributed to the Hasmonean polity, this newly independent state.
And that may connect, I'm curious if you think it does, with Steve Mason, very distinguished scholar who's part of the symposium that we're doing on your book. He argues that the term Judaismos actually is a quite technical term that is specifically linked to this period and this group of people, the Hasmoneans, that it has a sense almost of a kind of very, you could say, defensive or militarized creation of in this case, a full legal system that is, in your suggestion, hypothesis, may be imposed upon the text. And we just published a Marginalia Review of Matthew Novenson, professor of biblical studies at Princeton Theological Seminary, his book on Paul and Judaism, in which he's arguing, of course, that there was no Judaism. And he specifically focuses on there's only two instances of the term Judaismos in Paul. They're in the same exact passage in Galatians. And he argues that it's this, he argues based on Mason's work, it has this sense. Would you be broadly sympathetic with that? Maybe also the sense of there isn't anything like Judaism, but actually, if you are right, it could be we have a lot of converging evidence that our sense of Judaism as this sort of legal structure has to do very specifically with this family and even this Greek term Judaismus that's been anachronistically misunderstood for a long time in biblical studies as referring to another religion, like the religion of Israel is Judaism. But in fact, maybe Judaismos is this kind of movement or imposition that may have started with the Judeans and then spread to the neighbors in the Hasmonean or sometimes the Maccabean period.
I don't want to get too bogged down in definitions of what Judaismos would have meant, whether in Maccabees or in Paul's letters. I'm not 100% sure that I know how the terms were used. I think I know how the terms were used. My sense is that the terms were used. This term was used. Judaismos was used to mean acting like a Judean. And what's implied is acting like a Judean in keeping the laws of the Torah. And indeed, the earliest appearance of the term Judaismos is in Maccabees. So we have no use of the term before the Hasmonean period. But I don't want to make too much of that because theoretically we can have observance of Torah without the use of the term Judaismos. And by the way, Judaismos basically disappears from Jewish texts. We don't have any word like that at all, as Daniel Boyarin has shown. In any Judean texts after Paul, in Jewish texts throughout the centuries, throughout the Middle Ages until the modern period, Jews simply don't have a term for Judaism in any of the languages that the Jews were speaking. That doesn't mean that Judaism didn't exist. It simply means that there wasn't a term for it. I think, to my mind, the reason is that Jews were just Torah observance was so part of the matrix of everyday life that it just wasn't. That there wasn't a need for a word for it. Right? Fish don't have a word for water. Jews didn't have a word for Judaism. So I wouldn't make too much of when the word first appears, how often it is used. We can have widespread Torah observance without necessarily making use of a word for it. And whether or not Judaismos refers to that or not, I think it does. I think it does mean acting like a Judean, acting in the way of the Judeans, according to Torah law, but I wouldn't make too much of its appearance or its disappearance.
That's helpful. And for those listening, we'll post a link. We did a whole forum on Daniel Boyarin's book, Judaism, about these questions. Just as we have a few more minutes left, and there's so much that's opening up here, I'd love to just end by having you talk a bit about what possibilities you think this opens up, like where you think it can lead us, where your own scholarship is going. One of the big connections, I think, to a lot of areas is, since your argument is, as you've said, since 2022 when it came out, there's been no contestation of the basic facts of your argument that there's no evidence this is earlier. It raises the very interesting question, kind of like, well, what was going on? Which, of course, a lot of people have wondered about and written about. So could you just share maybe a bit about where your current work is or how you think this work can lead to new possibilities in the field?
Sure. So as far as my own work, I'm going backwards in time. I have a book which will be coming out within a few weeks, which will be focusing on the early Hellenistic period, so the period right before the Hasmoneans, to see how can we characterize Judean cult and culture right before the Hasmoneans appeared. So this will be coming out with Cambridge University Press. And then my next project will be to continue going backwards in time. So my interest here will be, again, my focus is always on the masses. It's always on the Judean population at large. And to try to characterize what was Judean cult and culture in these earlier periods. So we have Judeans, they have a cult, they have a culture. How can we characterize this? What is this looking at? And my hope is that aside from the question of the emergence of Judaism, that my book and what I'm doing here will start up interest in that 99.99% of the population that for all these years has been ignored by scholarship. I should just add one thing about scholarship and what scholars have been doing. It's not a surprise that scholars are interested in intellectuals. Scholars themselves are intellectuals. They're interested in intellectuals that penned the biblical texts. They're interested in the intellectuals that penned the rabbinic texts. They're interested in intellectuals, and the masses are less of interest to them. It's perhaps an elitism of some sort, but it's not surprising. I'm hoping that the work that I'm doing will open up the conversation about more broad societal questions and put the focus on the population at large rather than the intellectuals. The intellectuals are embedded within a larger population, and if we really want to understand the intellectuals, if that's what we want to focus on, that's fine. But we really do need to start thinking more about the population at large, which was the setting for where all these texts were penned.
Well, thanks to the reception of the book already and you working with us, I think you're really doing that, bringing attention to the masses. And we're honored that you're working with us at Marginalia to bring your work and explore it with other scholars. And this is a very exciting beginning of this symposium. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Adler, and sharing your work.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Yonatan. I think this is really tremendous, and I really appreciate your time. And I'm so excited that apparently you're